October 26, 1942. 150 miles north of Guadalcanal. The dawn is a thin, watery smear on the Pacific. The sea is the color of old coin and the air tastes of salt oil and the acrid tang of cordite. On the flight deck of USS Enterprise, Big E to her crew, men stagger beneath the weight of fatigue and adrenaline. The carrier pitches gently as a swarm of gray fighters and black-winged torpedo planes lift off into a sky already thick with tracer. Steam hisses from catapults. Pilots in leather helmets stare into the glare, hands tight on throttle and stick. Below decks, the ship hums with the business of staying alive. Engineers hammering bulkheads, damage control parties moving like clockwork through oily compartments, corpsmen with bandages and hard eyes. Enterprise slides into the opening chords of a large, ferocious carrier fight. Her air group has been launched. Her radar and lookouts have picked up the silhouette of a Japanese carrier force. On the quarterdeck, Captain Osborne B. Ozzy B. Hardison issues crisp orders, voice carrying over the thrum of engines and shouts. The smell of aviation fuel and hot metal hangs in the air. Out on the horizon, Japanese planes bloom like sudden black flowers. They are coming in waves, decks aflame with explosive intent. This is the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and Enterprise is sitting squarely in the music. The first bomb hits are sudden, hateful things, fireworks inside steel. Splinters fly across the hangar deck. A bomb punches through near the forward island and shreds a gas locker. For a few bloodless heartbeats it seems like the carrier might go under a single well-placed blow. Men shout, extinguishers hiss, and sailors throw themselves across wounded shipmates. 44 of Enterprise's crew will be dead and 75 wounded from the day's fighting, but the ship will not surrender. She keeps making steam, keeps launching and recovering planes as if her very engines were a willful thing. The strikes carved into her steel are severe, bomb hits and near misses that buckle plates, that lift deck steel like a surgeon's clam, and yet, even damaged, she refuses to go where the Japanese fleet is certain she should. Down. Below the flight deck, Lieutenant Commander Herschel A. Smith, the damage control officer, flows through the ship with a CB detachment on his heels, those Navy construction men turning from their shore duties into emergency shipwrights. They are patching bulkheads, shoring struts, controlling fires that could have spread into catastrophic detonations, and rigging jury systems to keep the ship upright. The repair work is a lesson in improvisation under fire, teams cutting and welding, pumping out flooded compartments while others rig temporary piping and jury power to keep key systems online. It's work that will save Enterprise that day and make a pattern for her wartime career. When she is struck, she is repaired quickly, often at sea, by men who know that the ship's survival is as much about iron and rivets as it is about morale and stubbornness. Out in the air, Enterprise's fighters dance in desperate arcs to meet the attackers. Grumman F-4F Wildcats dive and climb, leaving dark smears against the sky as they clash with Mitsubishi A-6M0s. Torpedo squadrons and dive bombers, SBD Dauntless and TBF/TBM torpedo planes, plow toward Japanese cruisers and carriers, their pilots praying that their ordnance will find vulnerable decks and decks will not find them. When the smoke clears, one American carrier has been put out of the fight. Hornet is burning and later will sink. But Enterprise, although scarred and bleeding, remains afloat, still capable of launching strikes and taking on survivors from the Hornet. On her deck sailors scrawl a defiant message, Enterprise versus Japan. It is the kind of small, private belligerence that becomes legend. For the Japanese, the day brings another kind of confusion. Reports filtered back through their intelligence channels claim they have sunk Enterprise, that a great gray carrier with a history of slipping from the jaws of destruction has at last been sent down. Flags are raised, messages go out, but on the ocean amid the flotsam and smoldering wreckage, Enterprise still moves. Where they expected wreckage they find only wake and smoke and later, another whisper of engines. The very fact that enemy dispatches announce her sinking on several occasions during the war, only to have her reappear days or weeks later, will earn the ship a reputation among Japanese sailors and pilots that borders on superstition. The Gray Ghost, a carrier that won't stay dead. That reputation will shape how both sides perceive her. An almost spectral presence that the Japanese think they have killed but which keeps returning to the fight. As afternoon slides toward a bruised twilight, Enterprise lists slightly, has patched holes and is still breathing. Men below decks work to keep the pumps moving. On the bridge, officers trade terse updates. Charts are scrawled with new positions. Messages are sent to higher command. Planes land with flaming guts or limber hope. Wounded are ferried below. The ship, slippery and stubborn, will limp away to Noumea for repairs and then, true to an emerging pattern, will be back for the next major clash. For now though, the Pacific is quiet enough for the wounded to count breaths and for the living to measure their luck. Outside the metal skin, the water steams where fires met ocean. Inside, Enterprise nurses herself like a fighter after a round in the ring, bloody, exhausted, unbeaten. The steaming sea lanes to Noumea are quiet in the days after Santa Cruz, but the atmosphere aboard Enterprise is anything but calm. The ship vibrates with constant activity. Bulkheads still groan from the damage, pumps rumble, and the air is thick with the tang of wet paint and burn insulation. Damage control crews move non-stop. Some men haven't slept more than 3 hours in 2 days. They climb ladders slick with condensation, step around pools of oil on the hangar deck, and work by the searing glow of arc welders. They know that every hour counts because the Pacific doesn't wait, and neither do the Japanese. When Enterprise glides into Noumea's harbor, she does so under her own power. A battered warrior striding into a field hospital instead of being carried. The ship looks wounded but defiant. Flight deck dented, gun tubs shredded, holes punched clean through her steel, scorch marks striping her island. The repair crews who greet her whistle low the way men do when they're impressed and troubled at the same time. The Big E has earned her nickname in full, the Gray Ghost. The ship the Japanese have already reported sunk. Multiple times. The nickname wasn't invented by U.S. sailors. It came from the enemy. Japanese pilots had claimed her destruction after Coral Sea, Midway, and now Santa Cruz. Yet each time, Enterprise returned to the horizon like a specter. Japanese intelligence radio intercepts referred to her with growing irritation and awe. Not lost. Not sunk. Not gone. At Noumea, the shipyard workers and Navy repair teams attack the damage like surgeons with saws and torches. They weld patches across rent plating. They reinforce beams and lay down fresh non-skid surface across areas burned clean. A crane swings new anti-aircraft gun mounts aboard. The ship's defensive arm grows meaner, heavier, more purposeful. No one wastes time. Intelligence suggests the Japanese Navy is regrouping for another push at Guadalcanal, and Enterprise is one of the few operational American carriers left in the Pacific. Losing her again now, even temporarily, could shift the entire balance. While the ship is under repair, Enterprise's pilots and flight deck crew train ashore. They know what waits for them. The same fighters, the same dive bombers, the same torpedo planes. Maybe even the same Japanese aviators they fought at Santa Cruz. They sharpen skills, drill formation flying, and track aircraft silhouettes in silhouette spotting classes. A few write letters home they know may never be sent. Many don't write anything at all. What would they say? By November 11, 1942, just 16 days after being hammered in battle, Enterprise is back at sea. 16 days. A carrier hit that hard, that recently, returning to combat at that speed is unheard of. But there she is, cutting through blue water toward Iron Bottom Sound, the waters north of Guadalcanal named for the countless ships lying twisted on the seafloor. And when she arrives, the Marines on the island look up and cheer. They know her silhouette. They know what her air wing means, bombs behind them. Fighters overhead. Relief. The Big E launches airstrikes against Japanese positions and shipping lanes, flying sortie after sortie to keep Guadalcanal supplied and defended. She covers convoys bringing ammunition, medicine, and fresh troops. She flies CAP to keep Betty bombers and Zero fighters from turning the island into a graveyard. To the Marines, Enterprise is more than a ship. She is a promise. Every time her engines growl across the sky, men in muddy foxholes grin and slap each other on the shoulders. The Ghost is back. She ain't sunk yet. Hell, she'll never sink. And the Japanese notice. When scout planes report Enterprise operating again, just half a month after they believed her destroyed, staff officers on Japanese carriers reportedly go quiet. Some shake their heads. Others mutter that the Americans have more carriers than expected. A few simply refuse to believe the report. To them, Enterprise has taken on an almost supernatural quality. A ship that dies then rises. A restless spirit of steel and steam. The Pacific War is far from over. And Enterprise will be there for nearly all of it. She will take more hits. She will suffer more flames. She will lose more men. And every time she will return. The Gray Ghost hasn't begun to haunt the Imperial Navy yet. November 14, 1942. Guadalcanal. The island stinks of wet earth, rot, cordite, and sweat. The jungle hangs heavy, its canopy trapping the heat like a lid on a boiling pot. Marines crouch in muddy foxholes around Henderson Field, fingers tight around rifles slick with humidity. Their uniforms are torn, stained, lived in. They are hungry, exhausted, and running on the kind of defiance that comes from refusing to die. Over the distant tree line, the dull roar of engines begins as a tremor, then builds into a rolling, sky-filling growl. Heads snap upward. Men shove helmets back. Some stand outright despite every lecture they've ever had about staying low. They know that sound intimately now. It is the voice of the USS Enterprise. SPD Dauntless dive bombers wheel above the island like hunting birds. Wildcats swoop lower, stitching the sky in wide protective arcs. To the Marines on the ground, these aircraft are not just planes. They are angels with radial engines. They are the difference between being pushed into the sea and pushing the enemy back into the jungle. Enterprise has returned from repairs faster than anyone thought possible, and she wastes no time becoming the island's steel guardian. Her air crews fly constant sorties, from dawn until the sun bleeds out behind the ridge line. They bomb supply barges creeping down the slot under moonlight. They hammer Japanese artillery positions hidden beneath jungle canopy. They duel the persistent Zero fighters that try to claw into their formations. On the flight deck far offshore, the scene is a continuous ballet of motion. The deck crew wear colored jerseys like characters in a living choreography. Yellow shirts directing traffic, purple shirts refueling aircraft, green shirts wrestling with catapults and arresting gear. Planes launch and launch again. The rhythm is relentless. The men barely speak. They move by muscle memory, by shared understanding, by sheer determination. Enterprise's pilots return from missions with bullet holes in their wings and rips in their flight suits. Some come back shaking, climbing out of their cockpits with thousand-yard stares. Others hit the deck grinning, adrenaline drowning out exhaustion. A few don't come back at all. Their empty places in the ready rooms tell stories more powerful than words. Yet Enterprise keeps going. One evening, near dusk, a Dauntless limps back to the carrier trailing smoke. Its landing gear won't deploy. The pilot, a lieutenant no older than 24, radios in with a voice hoarse from smoke and stress. The deck crew prepare a crash net. The landing signal officer stands at the edge of the deck, paddles out, his face set in a calm expression that hides everything else. The plane comes in low. Too low. The tail hook snags late and the rear fuselage slams onto the deck in a shower of sparks. The plane skids sideways, stops feet from the edge. The pilot climbs out laughing desperately, the kind of laugh that means he's alive and cannot believe it. The crew slap his back, drag the smoking plane clear, and within minutes another aircraft takes off from that same patch of steel. There is no pause. Not on Enterprise. Not in this war. By now, rumors are circulating among the Japanese. They say the carrier they sank refuses to stay sunk. They say American repair crews must be possessed. They say the ship is lucky. They say the Americans have more carriers hidden somewhere. They say she is a ghost. A gray ghost. The name sticks. The Japanese High Command receives scouting reports confirming that Enterprise is operating again near Guadalcanal. Some officers grit their teeth. Others shake their heads in silent disbelief. Pilots whisper the ship's name before flights the way men might whisper the name of a predator. The Marines meanwhile keep watching the sky. There is a moment in late November when a group of exhausted riflemen dig shallow trenches as the jungle rustles with unseen shapes. They are bracing for yet another night assault. Someone mutters, "Wish the ghost was out right now." Another Marine, barely old enough to shave, says quietly, "She will be. She always is." And he is right. The engines roll overhead a moment later. The men in the holes grin. They know they are not alone. From her steel decks, from her flight control rooms, from her humming engine spaces, the Enterprise projects something rare and powerful across the Pacific. The promise that the United States will not abandon those who fight on the ground. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. The gray ghost is not simply surviving. She is becoming legend. Before Guadalcanal, before the jungles and mud and whispered cheering from foxholes, the Enterprise had already earned her reputation the hard way. The memory of Midway still clung to her steel, not as glory but as scars. June 4, 1942. Midway Atoll. The Pacific was a sheet of cold blue glass, and the morning sun was a bright white hammer hanging in the sky. Enterprise steamed as part of Task Force 16, her hull slicing calmly through the water like a predator that knew exactly where it was going. The Japanese came first as distant specks, then angry hornets, then screaming aircraft dropping from the clouds. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters. The air was full of engine roar, steel, and fire. But the Enterprise kept moving, kept launching, kept answering. It was her dive bombers, the SPD Dauntless squadrons, that turned the tide. They found the Japanese carriers as they refueled and rearmed. The air around Hiryu, Kaga, and Akagi boiled with fire when Enterprise air crews came screaming down from altitude, throttles wide, dive brakes screaming like banshee wings. Bombs punched through flight decks, ripping open fuel lines, detonating stored ordnance. Japanese carriers burned like floating suns. Those who witnessed it never forgot it. The ferocity, the precision, the refusal to yield. But Midway came with losses. Pilots did not return. Planes vanished into the sea. The hangar deck fell quiet at the wrong moments. The ship that returned from Midway was victorious, yes, but she carried ghosts long before she was ever called one. It was after Midway that the Japanese first convinced themselves they had sunk her. Pilots returning to their carriers swore they had delivered killing hits. Intelligence officers recorded the reports. Fleet communications confirmed the loss. But Enterprise remained afloat. The ocean kept no such secret. So when the Pacific erupted again around the Solomons, when the Battle of the Eastern Solomons raged in August 1942, Enterprise was there too. And she was hit again. August 24th. A Japanese dive bomber descended like a burning hawk straight onto the carrier. A bomb tore through her decks, blasting apart compartments, sending steel fragments ricocheting down passageways. Flames clawed upward from the hangar deck. The heat was instant, brutal. Men near the blast disappeared in a cloud of fire and splintered steel. The battle sounded like the world breaking apart. Klaxons wailing, men shouting orders, hoses hissing, the booming rhythmic thump of anti-aircraft guns hammering the sky. Gunners tracked diving planes until their barrels glowed red. Shell casings rolled like brass rain across the deck. Enterprise shuddered, slowed but did not stop. Damage control teams fought through choking smoke, crawling beneath collapsing beams, dragging hoses into infernos that roared like living beasts. At one point, the entire carrier trembled under the strain of her own flames. The fire threatened the aviation fuel stores. If they went, the ship would go with them. But the men refused to give the ocean another grave. They fought the fire until their faces blistered, until their lungs burned, until their boots smoked. And as the flames died back, as the smoke vented into the sky, Enterprise steadied. She was wounded but alive. The Japanese fleet again announced her sinking. The U.S. Navy said little, but Enterprise returned to sea weeks later. And then Santa Cruz came and she was struck again. And she came back again. Now, in the waters off Guadalcanal, her legend was becoming something more than rumor. On the island, Marines spoke of her as if she were a living thing, a guardian spirit of steel and steam. But out in the Pacific, aboard battleships and cruisers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, another tone took hold. Pilots saw the same silhouette they swore they had destroyed. Radio operators heard her call sign again in intercepted transmissions. Officers sat in dim-lit planning rooms and frowned in quiet disbelief. A carrier was not supposed to be repaired that fast. A carrier was not supposed to survive that many battles. A carrier was not supposed to return. But Enterprise didn't know the rules of what was supposed to happen. She only knew how to fight. Her hull was scarred. Her decks had been patched. Her crew was exhausted. Yet she sailed on, engine steady, bow cutting forward through seas that had swallowed fleets and spit out bones. Enterprise was no longer just a warship. She was a promise to the Americans. She was a warning to the Japanese. And she was far from finished. January 1943. The waters off Guadalcanal had grown strangely calm. The sky was velvet dark, heavy with tropical humidity. It was the kind of night where even the stars seemed to hold their breath. Enterprise steamed as part of a small task force, her decks lit only by red combat lamps, her flight crew moving like silent ghosts in the dim glow. The men aboard her had grown used to this rhythm. Strike, repair, repeat. Their ship felt less like a machine now and more like something alive, something stubborn and proud and unwilling to surrender. They had seen her hit. They had seen her burning. They had watched friends carried below, and each time they wondered if she was finished. But every time, Enterprise shook off the damage and rose again. Tonight, however, the threat did not come from the sky. It came from the blackness ahead. A Japanese night surface group had slipped through the slot, a pack of destroyers and cruisers, their commanders trained in the brutal art of night fighting. They had no intention of engaging carriers at dawn. They had come to kill in darkness. The signal came from radar. Multiple fast contacts. Closing. Aboard Enterprise's bridge, officers leaned over plotting tables lit in faint green glow. The Situation Room hummed with updates. There was no panic, just tension tight and coiled like a spring. More reports. Fast. Closing. Too fast. The destroyers guarding Enterprise surged forward, throttles wide open, ready to intercept. Then the night erupted. The first American cruiser opened fire, its main guns flashing like lightning splits. Tracers arced across the sea, leaving neon trails that reflected on the black water. The Japanese answered with flares, sudden blooming suns that turned night into a stage of silver light. And in that sharp, blinding instant, the ocean caught fire. Shells screamed overhead. Torpedoes churned white trails through the water. Destroyers wheeled and lunged like wolves snapping at each other's throats. The battle raged so close that flashes lit up faces, metal glinted wet with sea spray, and shared shouts carried across the waves. Enterprise could only watch. Carriers were not meant to duel at knife fight distance. If she were hit now by a torpedo, she would likely die, and her crew knew it. The ship tremored at flank speed, turning hard, slipping away into the darkness like her nickname promised, a gray ghost fading behind confusion and gunfire. The battle surged closer. A U.S. destroyer, USS Fletcher, loosed torpedoes at a Japanese cruiser. The torpedoes hit, and a fireball rose high enough to momentarily light the Enterprise's flight deck. Men paused in their duties, staring out across the dark water as if they were watching the sea itself burn. Then came the scream of signal horns. A Japanese destroyer was charging, desperate to strike the carrier. Enterprise's escort, USS O'Bannon, turned straight into the threat. What followed was not elegant. It was raw, violent, desperate. O'Bannon fired point blank. The Japanese destroyer fired back. Water burst into columns where shells struck. The two ships passed each other so close sailors could see the whites of their enemies' eyes. Enterprise kept moving, kept escaping, kept surviving. By dawn, the ocean was littered with burning debris. Black smoke rolled low across the waves. And Enterprise was intact. She had not fired a shot in the battle. Not one. But every man at sea that night knew who the fight had been for. If she had gone down, the balance of the Pacific would have shifted again. Guadalcanal might have been retaken. The island campaign, the first stepping stone into the heart of the Japanese Empire, could have been lost. Enterprise did not win that night through firepower. She survived because other ships bled for her, fought for her, protected her with everything they had left. And the men aboard Enterprise understood that. When the sun rose, they walked her decks silently, looking out over the calm water that hid so much violence. The flight crews checked tie-down points and fuel lines. The gunners cleaned their barrels. The engineers tended the roaring boilers deep below decks. No hero speeches. No celebrations. Just the quiet, familiar rhythm of preparing to fight again. Because they knew something the Japanese were still learning. Enterprise was not a target to be sunk. She was a force to be endured. And she was not done haunting the Pacific. By the spring of 1944, the war in the Pacific had changed. The brutal, grinding fight for Guadalcanal had ended, and now the United States was pushing west, island by island, reef by reef, runway by runway. And at the center of it, driving every assault, covering every landing, shielding every convoy with wings of steel, was the USS Enterprise. She no longer looked like the same ship that had sailed into the Coral Sea years before. Her hull bore the marks of battles too numerous to list. Welded patches ran across her sides like scars. Her decks had been reinforced. Her anti-aircraft batteries had multiplied. Entire sections of her interior had been rebuilt at sea with whatever scrap her crew could scrounge. But her soul, that was untouched. When she returned to Pearl Harbor after months at sea, the dock crews would recognize her immediately. Not because of her profile, but because she arrived without fanfare. Quiet. Purposeful. As if she knew she would not remain in port long. The workers understood. They didn't ask questions. They went straight to work. Sparks flew. Rivets hammered. Fresh paint rolled. Crates of ammunition were hoisted aboard with the practiced urgency of men who know their work is life or death. Within days, the Enterprise was back out into the broad blue. The next storm she sailed into was the Marshall Islands campaign, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Roynamore. In those battles, she didn't just strike. She dominated. Her aircraft flew bombing runs against hardened island positions, cut Japanese supply lines, and destroyed airfields before enemy fighters could even get off the ground. The roar of her engines became the soundtrack of advancing American infantry. Then came Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific. A fortress-ringed lagoon packed with warships, submarines, fuel depots, and air power. The kind of stronghold that, on paper, should bleed any attacker dry. Enterprise didn't hesitate. Her air wings swept into the lagoon like avenging hawks. They dropped bombs onto cruisers trying to escape. They strafed supply ships trying to hide among coral shoals. They burned fuel depots until thick columns of black smoke smeared the sky. And then, as if to remind the world who she really was, Enterprise returned again to the front line almost before the Japanese understood what had hit them. But even as she fought, everyone aboard felt the war stretching longer, darker, heavier. The stakes grew higher. The Japanese were beginning to fight differently now. Their pilots were younger, their aircraft more desperate, their tactics more reckless. These were not the seasoned aviators of 1941. These were men instructed to crash their planes into American ships if they could not return. Kamikazes. Enterprise, who had already cheated death a dozen times, was now hunted by pilots who had no intention of surviving. The crew could feel it in the air. Each general quarters alarm carried a new edge. Each incoming radar contact felt like a coin flip. One afternoon, during a fast-moving strike near the Marianas, a Japanese Zero broke through her fighter screen. The pilot dove straight toward the flight deck, engines screaming, wings shaking from the strain. Anti-aircraft guns stitched the sky with red-hot tracers. The ship shuddered from the sheer volume of fire. The plane came on anyway. It missed the deck by yards, only because a final burst from a 40mm Bofors ripped the engine apart in midair. The burning fighter cartwheeled into the sea, exploding in a tall, white fountain. No one cheered. They simply returned to their stations. Even survival was routine now. Enterprise had become something more than metal and machinery. She had become a symbol, not of luck, not even of power, but of endurance. The kind of endurance that outlasts fear. The kind that refuses to bend. The kind that makes enemies whisper. Her crew no longer asked if she would return. They asked only where. Because wherever the next battle would be, the gray ghost was already on her way. April 11, 1945. Off Okinawa. The sea was gray and uneasy, churned by distant storm winds and the constant rumble of naval gunfire. The sky was low and thick with cloud, the kind that blurred horizons and swallowed aircraft whole. This was no longer the war of Midway or the Coral Sea. No swift duels of carriers trading bomber waves. No elegant maneuvering of fleets across wide blue water. This was a siege. A fight against waves of men who did not intend to return. Enterprise moved with her task group in tight defensive formation, destroyers and cruisers forming a steel ring around her. On radar screens deep inside her island superstructure, blips flickered and multiplied. The operator's voice was steady, but the words came fast. Multiple inbound. Bearing 090. Low altitude. Speed increasing. Kamikazes. The crew had trained for this. They had lived through it. But every man aboard understood that no amount of training changed the fact that the attackers did not care whether they died. For them, dying was the mission. General quarters sounded. The ship came alive. Men sprinted to gun stations. The 5-inch mounts elevated. The 40mm Bofors swiveled into position. Belt after belt of gleaming ammunition clattered into tray feeds. On the flight deck, aircraft handlers lashed down everything that wasn't already bolted to steel. The air smelled of oil, salt, and something else, something sharp, metallic, electric. Anticipation. The sky cracked open with engine noise. First came a Zero low, darting in tight, unpredictable cuts. A Wildcat from Combat Air Patrol dropped in behind it, guns chattering, tracers tearing the sky. The Zero exploded before it ever reached the formation, a flash and a cloud of debris spattering into the waves. Then came the second. Then the third. Anti-aircraft fire turned the air into a cage of fire and shrapnel. The sea below rippled with shockwaves. The gunners aboard Enterprise tracked everything, shapes, shadows, specks, fingers tight on triggers polished by sweat and repetition. Then the one everyone missed. A dive from the clouds. Straight down. A white flash of wings and rising scream of an engine pushed past its limits. The Kamikaze slammed into the flight deck near the forward elevator. The world went white. Men were flung off their feet. Steel buckled like paper. Burning fuel sprayed across deck planks. The elevator platform was blasted into twisted metal, half lifted, half shattered. Smoke roared upward in a black column that swallowed the sky. Fire crews were there instantly, hoses unfurling, foam cannons blasting white chemical clouds across the flames. Flight deck handlers dragged burning aircraft away from exploding ammunition. Corpsmen moved through smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hands, following the sound of voices calling for help. The ship listed slightly to starboard. The engines shuddered. The flight deck glowed with heat. But the Enterprise did not slow. Not yet. Pilots who were already in the air continued their strike missions. Fighters returning from combat diverted to other carriers or, when fuel ran too low, ditched near destroyers whose crews waited at the rails to throw lines and pull them from the sea. Below decks, damage control men sealed compartments and rerouted power lines. Welders cut through collapsed bulkheads to reach trapped sailors. The Big E had been hit before, many times, and the crew knew exactly what to do. The fire raged for hours. But slowly, through sweat, exhaustion, burns, and grit, it died. Pumps cleared the flooded compartments. The list corrected. The smoke cleared enough to see the ocean again. Enterprise had survived yet another strike. But this time something was different. This time the damage was worse. The forward elevator was gone. The flight deck could not safely launch or recover aircraft. She could still sail. She could still breathe. But she could not fight. The Gray Ghost, the ship that had returned again and again and again, was silent. As the sun set, the ocean turned red gold. The ship's crew lined the scorched flight deck, watching the carrier's wake stretch behind her like a long, pale scar across the sea. No speeches. No music. Just the hush of wind over steel. Enterprise was leaving the front. For the first time in the war, not because she was sunk, but because she had finally earned her rest. When Enterprise limped away from Okinawa, she did so under her own power. Not towed. Not dragged. She moved forward on engines that had carried her since before Pearl Harbor, through seas that had swallowed carriers greater than her. Her hull was battered, her deck warped, and smoke stains streaked her island structure like war paint. But she was afloat. And every sailor aboard knew what that meant. She had not been defeated. Only relieved. She steamed eastward toward Ulithi, then Pearl Harbor, then home. The journey was long and strangely quiet. The Pacific that had once been alive with dogfights, torpedo wakes, and towering columns of flame now stretched empty and vast. Men slept in long, dreamless stretches. Others wandered the decks, touching the railings, the tie-down points, the scarred panels as though reacquainting themselves with an old friend. Some spoke softly of those the ship carried no longer. They remembered pilots who never returned from dives, gunners who never rose from behind their sights, machinists lost below in compartments swallowed by fire. The Enterprise carried thousands of men, and the memory of many more. As she approached Pearl Harbor, signals began to crackle across the radio waves. Ships shifted position to greet her. Tugs and small craft cut across her bow like excited children. And on the docks, thousands gathered. Sailors, Marines, civilians, shipyard workers, nurses, officers, people who knew her silhouette by heart. They watched her enter the harbor slowly, like a veteran stepping off the battlefield on her own legs. Her scars were visible now in daylight, the torn forward elevator, the patched hangar walls, the scorched flight deck. She looked like what she was, a survivor of every major Pacific battle since 1941. And the harbor was silent. Not from sorrow, but from awe. For 4 years the Enterprise had been everywhere the fighting was hardest. She had been the first to strike back after Pearl Harbor. She had been at Midway when the tide turned. She had shielded the Marines at Guadalcanal. She had hunted the Imperial fleet across every mile of open ocean. She had taken hit after hit after hit, and returned every time. The only American carrier to fight from the first week of the war to the very last. The Gray Ghost. The ship that would not die. Repairs began, but there was a sense, quiet at first, then spoken aloud, that her fighting days were done. The war itself was nearing its final pages. Newer carriers, younger carriers, larger carriers were now rolling out of American shipyards in a steady tide of steel. Enterprise had done more than enough. She didn't need to prove anything ever again. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, Enterprise was chosen for a singular honor. She wouldn't sit quietly in a harbor. She wouldn't rest in anonymity. She would bring home the men who had fought and lived. She became the lead ship in Operation Magic Carpet, ferrying soldiers and sailors back across the ocean. Her decks, once stained with fire and oil, now echoed with laughter, card games, exhausted sleep, and the relieved silence of men seeing another sunrise. No bombers. No fighters. No alarms. Just homecoming. And when she finally reached the United States, the crowds on shore erupted. Flags flew. Brass bands played. People embraced and wept and cheered. Veterans in faded uniforms stood at attention as she passed, some saluting through trembling hands. The Enterprise did not answer, did not bow, did not announce herself. She simply glided on, quiet and steady, the way she always had. Years passed. The war ended. Fleets changed. Steel aged. And eventually the Gray Ghost was retired. Not scrapped in shame. Not forgotten. But remembered by every man who served aboard her, and every enemy who tried to sink her. In museums, in books, in whispers shared by old sailors leaning over cups of coffee, her name lived on. USS Enterprise. CV6. The ship that refused to die. If you stood on the deck of a modern carrier today, the sleek, nuclear-powered successor that bears her name, you might feel something beneath your feet. A presence. A memory. A legend carried forward on steel. Because some ships are more than metal. Some are stories. And stories do not sink.